poor boy was just trying to earn a few dollars washing car windows until one glance inside a luxury SUV changed his life forever. The light at Wabash and Randolph turns red every 90 seconds, and for 3 years that light had been the closest thing 13-year-old Ethan Reyes had to a job. Horns, exhaust, the wind coming off Lake Michigan hard enough to make his eyes water. He moved car to car with a squeegee in one hand and a spray bottle in the other, and most people waved him off before he got within 10 feet. Some locked their doors. A few leaned out and told him to get a real job, like a 13-year-old could walk into an office building and ask for one. Ethan had stopped hearing that a long time ago. He had to. Every dollar he made went to his mother's dialysis, and there wasn't room left in him to also carry what strangers thought of him for earning it this way. Rosa Reyes used to sing off-key while she cooked. She worked doubles as a hospital housekeeper and still had energy to help with homework at night. Then her kidneys started failing, slowly, then all at once, and now she needed treatment 3 times a week and medication that cost more than their rent. Ethan traded his backpack for a bucket every day after school and didn't come home until the sky over the loop went the color of a fresh bruise. He had regulars. Tony Russo ran the hot dog cart on the corner and slipped him a free bag of chips when business was slow. Grace Okafor drove a beat-up Civic and gave him $2 every single day, rain or shine, because he reminded her of her own son back in Lagos. There was a silver BMW that belonged to a man named Grant Halsey, who never let Ethan near his windshield and always had something sharp to say about kids who should be in school. And there was the man on the corner everyone called Preacher. Nobody remembered why. He wore the same army jacket every day, sat on the same milk crate by the newsstand, and said almost nothing to anyone. Most drivers looked straight through him. Ethan didn't. Every day he brought Preacher half of whatever Tony had given him, and every day Preacher said the same thing back. "You're gonna do something big one day, kid. I can feel it in my bones." Ethan always laughed it off. What did a homeless old man know about big things? But there was something in the way Preacher's eyes tracked the traffic, sharp, cataloging like he was still working a case nobody had assigned him, that Ethan never asked about. That Thursday started like any other. Grey sky, threatening rain that never came. Ethan had $11 by 4 o'clock, enough for ground turkey instead of instant noodles. He was counting bills in his pocket when the light turned red and a black Escalade rolled into the front row. Windows tinted so dark they looked like poured tar, chrome grille gleaming even under flat grey light. Ethan had learned to read cars the way other kids read faces. Expensive ones meant a good tip or a driver who wouldn't roll down the window. He walked up anyway. He had no way of knowing it was the last easy decision he'd make for a long time. By 4:30, he'd made $11, which meant dinner would be more than instant noodles. Maybe the ground turkey Rosa liked, the kind that came in the yellow package on sale Thursdays. He kept the bills folded twice in his front pocket, where he could feel them against his leg while he worked. A habit he'd picked up after a bigger kid tried to snatch his bucket money outside the currency exchange 2 winters back. Tony had chased the kid off with a spatula, still covered in onions, yelling loud enough that half the block turned to look. Ethan never forgot that. It was the kind of thing that made a corner feel less like a corner and more like a place people actually watched out for him. He liked to think Rosa didn't know exactly how he made the extra money some weeks. She probably did. Mothers always did. But she never asked. And he never explained, and that quiet agreement between them had become its own kind of kindness, the two of them protecting each other from things neither wanted to say out loud. The sky stayed the color of wet cement all afternoon, threatening rain that never came, and by the time the 4:15 bus rolled through, Ethan had settled into the rhythm that made the corner bearable. Squeegee, spray, wipe, step back, wait for the next window to lower or not lower, move on. It wasn't much of a life, it was the one he had. At first it looked like nothing. The Escalade idled up front, engine humming low and expensive, and Ethan raised his squeegee toward the windshield the way he had 1,000 times. The window cracked an inch. A man's voice, clipped, said, "Not interested, kid. Move along." Ethan had heard that 100 times too. He started to step back, and then the driver's door opened. A man got out, tall, broad-shouldered, in a suit that cost more than Rosa made in a month. He walked to the back of the SUV, keys jingling, and popped the cargo hatch. For most people at a red light, 30 seconds is nothing. For Ethan, standing exactly where he was, the whole street tilted, because in the half-second before that hatch slammed shut, he saw a young woman, wrists bound, a strip of cloth over her mouth, eyes wide with a kind of fear that doesn't need translation. Their eyes locked. Her lips moved. No sound. The light was too far and the traffic too loud, but Ethan would swear for the rest of his life that he read the shape of that word perfectly. Help. The hatch slammed. The driver turned, and for 1 second his eyes found Ethan's too, cold, doing math, measuring exactly how much the kid with the squeegee had seen. "Get lost!" he snapped, and climbed back in. The light turned green. The Escalade pulled away and disappeared into traffic like it had never existed. Ethan stood frozen at the crosswalk, water dripping off his squeegee onto his sneakers, his heart slamming so hard he thought people around him must hear it. He looked around. Tony was busy with a customer. Grace's Civic wasn't even there today. Everyone else stared straight ahead, wrapped in their own private Thursday. Only one person was looking right at him. Preacher had gone still on his crate, eyes locked on Ethan with an intensity that hadn't been there a minute ago, the look of a man watching something click into place after a long sleep. "Kid," he called, "what did you just see?" Ethan was already running. 3 blocks, lungs burning, that woman's eyes burned into the back of his skull like a photograph he never wanted to take. He didn't know that the moment the Escalade cleared the intersection, a phone call had already gone out. And it wasn't to the police. It was to someone who worked for them. Ethan replayed it on the run. The hatch opening, the woman's eyes, the way her wrists had been wrapped in something dark. Maybe tape, maybe rope. He couldn't be sure, and that not being sure would bother him for days. He kept thinking he should have gotten the plate. Detective shows always had someone getting the plate. But he'd been staring at her face, not the bumper, and by the time his brain caught up enough to think plate, the SUV was already 3 cars deep into traffic and gone. His sneakers slapped concrete, dodging a woman with a stroller, a man balancing 2 pizza boxes, a cart of pretzels that nearly caught him in the hip. None of them looked twice. That was the strange part he'd think about later. That something so enormous could happen in the middle of a city block and the city just kept moving around it, indifferent, the way water closes back over a stone. The substation on Wabash smelled like burnt coffee. Ethan burst through the door, chest heaving. "I need to report a kidnapping. There was a woman tied up in the back of a car." The desk sergeant, a heavy-set man named Daniel Briggs, looked up with the particular tiredness of someone who'd heard every excuse a Chicago afternoon could produce. "Slow down. Start over." Ethan did. The Escalade, the tinted windows, the man in the suit, the woman's bound wrists, the word she'd mouthed through the glass. Briggs listened, and something in his posture went carefully still. Not concern. Something colder. "Black SUV, tinted windows, guy in a suit," Briggs said finally, leaning back. "You know how many black Escalades are registered in Cook County?" "I'm not making this up. Nobody said you were. Maybe you saw something and your imagination filled in the rest. Happens." He glanced at Ethan like he was doing math. "How old are you? 12? 13? 13. He said it like it settled the whole conversation. "I'll write it up, but without a plate, without a real description, there's not much we can do." She looked right at me. She said, "Help." Briggs stood, already halfway to the break room. "Go home, kid. Take care of your mom." Then he laughed, short, under his breath, the kind of laugh that told Ethan exactly how seriously his report had just been filed away. Ethan walked out feeling smaller than he had in years. What he didn't see, the second the door swung shut, Briggs's tired expression dropped like a mask coming off. He waited a few minutes, ducked into the stairwell, and pulled out a second phone. Not his department one, a slim black burner from an inside jacket pocket. He dialed a number saved under no name. "It's handled," he said. "Kid came in babbling about the woman. I shut it down." A smooth, unbothered voice on the other end said, "Good. Find out who he is. I don't like loose ends walking around my city." Briggs's stomach tightened, the way it always did when he remembered exactly whose money he'd taken 3 years ago, back when a gambling debt got past anything his salary could cover, and a soft-spoken man named Julian Ashworth made the problem disappear in exchange for small favors, looking the other way on a traffic stop, losing a report, making a complaint evaporate before it reached someone who'd ask real questions. He'd always told himself none of it hurt anyone. He was about to find out this particular favor, burying a 13-year-old's report about a kidnapped woman, was the one that would catch up with him. Across the city, in an office decorated with photos of himself shaking the mayor's hand and cutting ribbons at children's hospitals, Julian Ashworth hung up his phone, straightened his tie, and said 4 words to the man standing across the desk. "Find the boy, quietly." Nobody in that room called it what it actually was, but Ethan, walking home with his squeegee bucket in one hand, had just become a target. Ethan didn't tell Rosa what happened that night. He sat across from her at the kitchen table while she picked at a plate of rice, and he almost said it twice. "Mom, I saw something today," and both times he swallowed it back down. She had enough. Her hands shook a little these days, not always, just sometimes, usually near the end of the week before her next treatment, and he'd learned to notice it without saying anything about that either. He told her school was fine. He told her Tony gave him extra chips. He did not tell her that a stranger's eyes had locked onto his through a sliver of tinted glass and said one silent word that he could still feel sitting behind his ribs like a stone he'd swallowed. That night, he lay on the pullout and stared at the water stain on the ceiling that had always looked a little like Florida, and for the first time in a long time, he was afraid of something he couldn't name a dollar amount for. That night, Ethan lay awake on the pull-out couch, listening to the window unit rattle and his mother's uneven breathing through the wall. Every time headlights swept the ceiling, his stomach clenched. He told himself He was being paranoid. The cops hadn't believed him, so surely that was the end of it. He had no way of knowing that being dismissed and being forgotten were two very different things. The next afternoon, he noticed the car. A dark grey sedan parked half a block from the intersection, engine running, two men inside who never got out, never ordered from Tony's cart, never did anything but sit and watch. The next day, it was there again, and the day after that. Tony noticed too. "You know those guys?" he asked, flipping a hot dog. "No," Ethan said, and real fear settled into his stomach like a stone. That was the day Preacher finally called him over. "Sit," he said, patting the crate beside him. His voice had changed since the day of the Escalade, sharper, none of the rambling people expected from a man who lived on a corner. "You've been made. Those two haven't moved in 3 hours. Cops fidget. That's surveillance. Professional." Ethan's mouth went dry. "Surveillance of what?" "You. What did you actually see in that Escalade?" So Ethan told him everything. When he finished, Preacher went quiet, staring at the traffic with something between grief and recognition, the look of a man remembering a room he'd sworn never to walk back into. "What?" Ethan pressed. "Nothing," Preacher said, too fast. Ethan had spent enough afternoons reading the faces of drivers who lied about tips they never planned to give. He knew a lie when he heard one. "You know something." Preacher reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded, yellowed newspaper clipping, soft at the creases from being unfolded 1,000 times. He hesitated, then tucked it away before Ethan could see more than a blurred photo and a headline he couldn't make out. "Go home," Preacher said instead. "Straight home. If that sedan follows you, run toward people, not away from them. Understand?" Ethan understood only that his fear had just been confirmed by someone who clearly knew what he was talking about. He ran home faster than he'd ever run, and though the sedan didn't follow, not that day, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He didn't know the men in that sedan worked for a private security firm on retainer with Julian Ashworth's foundation, the same foundation whose banners hung in children's hospitals, whose founder had just been named Chicagoan of the Year for the 3rd time. The same foundation that, 3 floors above its public offices behind a locked door, ran something far darker than galas. That night, a black sedan idled outside Ethan's building, engine off, lights out, patient in the way that should terrify anyone who understands what that kind of patience usually means. They weren't ready to move yet, but at the edge of Ethan's fear, a quieter, more dangerous thought had started to take root. What if the old man on the corner knows more than he's telling me? He almost asked Tony about it the next morning, standing by the cart while the griddle popped and hissed. "You ever notice Preacher watching the cars different than everybody else?" Tony shrugged, flipping a hot dog without looking up. "Preacher watches everything different, kid. That's just Preacher." Ethan let it go, but the question stayed lodged somewhere behind his teeth for the rest of the day, resurfacing every time he glanced toward the milk crate by the newsstand and found the old man's eyes already on him, steady, unreadable, like a man keeping score of something only he understood the rules to. Everyone at that intersection had a theory about Preacher. Tony figured he was a veteran who'd never gotten help. Grace thought he'd lost everything in the housing crash. Fareed Hassan, who ran the newsstand, just assumed he was one of the thousands the city had quietly failed. Nobody was entirely right, and nobody was entirely wrong. What none of them knew was that the man on the milk crate had once been Detective Frank Merrick, 20 years in the Chicago PD's Homicide Division, decorated twice, respected by everyone who'd worked beside him. Merrick built his career on one stubborn belief: the truth mattered more than convenience. 12 years ago, that belief cost him everything. He'd been chasing a string of disappearances tied to corruption inside his own department, and the thread led further up than anyone wanted him to go, until his own partner turned up dead in what got ruled a car accident. Merrick saw the bruising on her knuckles. That wasn't from an accident. When he pushed, doors closed, evidence vanished. His captain suggested a leave of absence for his own good. He refused to stop, so the department stopped him. A manufactured complaint, a forced resignation, a pension revoked on a technicality nobody could quite explain. His wife left, took their daughter to Ohio, said it was the only way to keep the family safe from whatever he'd stirred up. He never blamed her. Frank Merrick disappeared from public life, and for years nobody knew what became of the detective who'd once cracked cases that stumped entire task forces. He became exactly what the city assumed he was: a man on a crate, invisible. Except he hadn't stopped investigating, he'd just stopped doing it where anyone could see. From his corner, he'd spent years quietly watching the same rot resurface. Names whispered in connection with disappearances the news never covered. Wealthy men who moved through the city with the confidence that only comes from knowing the rules don't apply to you. One name kept surfacing: Julian Ashworth. Frank had never proven a single thing. Ashworth was too careful, too beloved, but when Ethan described that Escalade, something in Frank that had been dormant for 12 years came back online all at once. That night, long after the intersection emptied, Frank sat alone with the newspaper clipping he'd carried for over a decade, a photo of himself in dress uniform beneath a headline about corruption allegations that had ended his career instead of the men who deserved it. "Not this time," he said to no one. The next morning, he was waiting for Ethan with something new in his eyes. "Kid, I need you to trust me. I think I know who put that woman in the back of that Escalade, and if I'm right, we're both about to become very inconvenient to a very powerful man." Ethan sat down slowly on the overturned crate across from him. How would a guy who sits on a corner know something like that? Frank didn't answer right away. He looked older in that moment than Ethan had ever seen him. Not tired old, but worn down old, like a stone that had taken 12 years of weather. "Because I used to be somebody who was paid to know things like that," Frank said finally. "A long time ago, before I learned the hard way that some people you're not supposed to find out about." "Preacher's not even your real name, is it?" It wasn't really a question. Frank almost smiled. "No, it's not." He didn't offer the real one yet, and Ethan didn't push. There'd be time for that later, or so he thought. Julian Ashworth was, by every visible measure, one of the most admired men in Chicago. His face turned up on local news twice a month. Ribbon cuttings, scholarship announcements, the annual holiday toy drive. He'd built his fortune in commercial real estate, revitalizing blocks that had sat abandoned for years. He gave generously. He never raised his voice in public. That was exactly what made him dangerous. Behind the galas, Ashworth had spent nearly 2 decades building something far more profitable than real estate. A network that moved people the way other men moved cargo. Women recruited with false promises of modeling contracts, run through shell companies and private carriers, sold into arrangements that made a small circle of men obscenely wealthy while leaving no fingerprints anywhere near their names. Sophie Pierce had made one catastrophic mistake 3 days earlier. She recognized a face at a donor event, a woman who'd vanished from a shelter 6 months prior after Sophie had quietly started asking questions. She hadn't known who she was really dealing with. By the time she understood, it was too late. None of that was known yet to Ethan or Frank. What they had was a description, a corrupt cop's behavior, and Frank's decade-old instincts. "We start small," Frank said, pulling out a notebook worn soft at the edges. Which way did the Escalade turn? Ethan closed his eyes, forcing himself back into that half-second. West, toward the expressway. Good. Ashworth Towers off Wacker. If that SUV belongs to him or his circle, West tracks. You really think it's him? The guy from the news? The one who built the kids' hospital wing? Frank's jaw tightened. The men who do the worst things build the best disguises. Whatever this is, it's been running a long time, and it's been running quiet. Over the following days, an exhausted teenager and a homeless ex-cop pieced together fragments that meant nothing alone and something terrible together. Frank still had contacts. Retired cops and reporters who remembered exactly who Frank Merrick used to be. A retired records clerk reached through a payphone outside a currency exchange, confirmed a pattern. Young women new to the city, without family close enough to keep asking questions, reported missing and then quietly closed as resolved, with no paperwork behind it. "Someone's cleaning up after them," Frank muttered. "Someone with the pull to close cases that should never close that easy." Ethan felt a chill. "Officer Briggs." Frank looked up, sharp. "Say that again." "Briggs. Daniel Briggs. He's the one who laughed me out of the station." Frank went very still, the look of a man watching a sideways puzzle piece finally turn and click. "I know that name. Briggs transferred out of Vice 4 years ago, and nobody ever explained why. If he's in this, it's not a coincidence, kid. It's a pattern. And patterns mean this has been running a lot longer than a few weeks." Neither of them knew that 3 blocks away, on the 40th floor of Ashworth Tower, a different conversation was already underway. One about to introduce a face neither of them expected to become part of this story at all. "We need a name at that address," Frank said, tapping the notebook. "Somebody who actually knows what happens inside that foundation, not just what gets printed about it." "Where do we even start with that? We're a kid and a—" Ethan caught himself before he said it. Frank raised an eyebrow. "A homeless guy? You can say it. I've heard worse this week." Ethan flushed. "I didn't mean it like that." "I know you didn't." Frank closed the notebook and stood, joints cracking audibly in the cold. "But you're right that we need somebody with a badge, a byline, or a subpoena. We've got neither. So we start building something out of nothing, the way I used to before anybody trusted me with a real case file." He looked down the street toward the glass towers rising over the river, Ashworth's building somewhere among them, indistinguishable from the rest at this distance. "Somewhere in one of those buildings," he said, "is a piece of paper with Sophie Pierce's name on it. We just have to find the person dumb enough or angry enough or guilty enough to hand it to us." Her name was Claire Whitfield, and she'd spent 4 years chasing the kind of story that could finally get her byline off the Metro Briefs page. She worked for the Chicago Beacon, a paper that ran on subscriptions and stubbornness instead of deep pockets. She was smart, relentless, the type who followed anonymous tips down alleys other reporters wouldn't walk. But 4 years of watching less talented colleagues land bigger stories because they knew the right people had worn something down in her. Somewhere along the way, the hunger to expose the truth started competing with a quieter hunger, to finally be the one who mattered. A records clerk mentioned, almost in passing, that some kid had come in with a wild kidnapping story that got laughed out of the building. Most reporters would have dismissed it. Claire's gut told her not to. She found Ethan at the intersection, no camera, no notebook, just a warm smile and an outstretched hand. "Ethan, right? I'm Claire. I write for the Beacon. I heard you had a scary week and nobody wanted to listen." Ethan eyed her. Frank, sitting nearby, watched with the sharpened attention of a man who'd run 1,000 witness interviews and recognized every trick, including the ones being used on someone he'd started to care about. "Why should I trust you?" Ethan asked. "You shouldn't," Claire said. "Not yet. But if what you saw is real, I won't stop until the whole city knows. I don't back down." Something in her voice cut through his exhaustion. Someone believed him, someone with a platform. Frank was harder to convince. "Reporters need stories," he told Ethan privately. "Sometimes that need gets bigger than the truth. Be careful what you hand her. She wants to help. Maybe today." For a week, Claire proved herself useful, verifying old records with her press credentials, cross-referencing city permits against Frank's pattern of disappearances, sitting with Ethan for hours, drawing out every detail of that terrifying afternoon. What neither of them knew was that Claire had made a call of her own 3 days in, not to her editor, to a PR contact at the Ashworth Family Foundation. It started, in her mind, as something almost defensible, a routine request for comment. But the man on the other end didn't offer a comment. He offered an exclusive career-making sit-down with Julian Ashworth himself, timed to the Foundation's biggest announcement of the year. All she had to do, he said smoothly, was keep him informed about her kidnapping story. Claire told herself it wasn't a betrayal. She told herself she was managing 2 sources at once, the way any smart reporter would. She told herself the boy and the old man were probably chasing nothing anyway. None of it was true. Somewhere inside Ashworth Tower, a man who'd spent 15 years making sure nothing traced back to him made a quiet note in a private file. "The reporter is cooperating." It was time to move faster. Claire told herself she'd tell Frank and Ethan everything eventually, once she had enough to actually publish, once the story was airtight enough that nobody could bury it the way Frank's own case had been buried 12 years ago. She told herself the interview with Ashworth was just leverage, a way to get closer to the truth than either of them could get alone. She believed that, mostly, on the good days. On the bad ones, lying awake in her studio apartment with her laptop open to a blank document she couldn't make herself write, she knew exactly what she was doing, and she did it anyway, because 4 years of being passed over had taught her that principles didn't pay rent and bylines did. The break came from a source nobody expected. Digging through old shelter intake records for her investigation, Claire found a missing persons report filed 11 days earlier. A young woman named Sophie Pierce, reported missing by her mother after a week of silence. Filed quietly at the family's specific request. The name alone stopped Claire's breath. Pierce, as in Judge Eleanor Pierce, one of a handful of federal judges in the Northern District of Illinois, known for taking on organized crime cases, other judges avoided. Claire brought it straight to Frank and Ethan. For a long moment, nobody said anything. "That's her," Ethan finally whispered, staring at the printed photo. Even grainy and black and white, there was no mistaking those eyes, the same eyes that had found his through a sliver of tinted glass. Frank's expression went dead serious. A federal judge's daughter, kidnapped, and the family asked for silence. Why would a mother do that if her kid's missing? Wouldn't she want people looking? Not if someone convinced her that going public gets her daughter killed, Frank said. That's a threat, not a request. Somebody got to Judge Pierce directly. The implications spread out, each one darker. If Ashworth's people had the reach to threaten a sitting federal judge, this wasn't just trafficking hiding behind a philanthropist's smile. This had tentacles inside the institutions built to stop it. Claire pushed harder that week, maybe guilt she hadn't fully admitted to yet, and tracked down a former assistant from Judge Pierce's chambers who'd quit 2 weeks earlier. Over coffee, hands shaking, the woman confirmed what Frank already suspected. "Someone called the judge directly," she said. "I don't know what was said. She came out of that call white as a sheet, cancelled everything, never spoke of it again." "Did she mention a name?" Frank pressed. "Anything?" The woman shook her head. Just that whoever called knew things about her daughter's schedule. Nobody outside the family should have known. Things only someone watching closely could know. That detail chilled Ethan more than anything so far. Someone had been watching Sophie Pierce for weeks, maybe months, mapping her routines before ever taking her. This wasn't opportunistic. This was patient, methodical. That night, Frank sat with his notebook open, adding Sophie's name to a growing list. If Ashworth's people are bold enough to threaten a federal judge, he said, mostly to himself, then he believes he's untouchable, and men who believe that stop checking who's still watching from the shadows. Ethan looked at the old man everyone else called invisible and felt, for the first time since this started, something that resembled hope. "We're going to get her back, aren't we?" Frank didn't answer right away. "We're going to try," he finally said. "But listen to me. The deeper this goes, the worse it gets. And I don't think we've found the bottom of it yet." Less than a mile away, in a corner booth downtown, Claire Whitfield slid a folder across a table to a man from Ashworth's foundation, everything they'd found so far, including the one name that would put all three of them in more danger than any of them understood. Frank spent that night pacing the length of the auto shop, notebook open, crossing out lines and rewriting them, the way he used to work a caseboard back when he still had walls to pin photos to. "Judge like Eleanor Pierce doesn't scare easy," he said. "I sat in her courtroom twice years ago, back when I still had a badge. She once held a city alderman in contempt for showing up late. If somebody got her to go silent, it wasn't a threat over money, it was a threat over her daughter's life, laid out specific enough that she believed every word of it." Ethan sat on an overturned bucket, hugging his knees. "So, what happens if we find her? Sophie, I mean. What happens to us?" Frank didn't sugarcoat it. If we're careful and lucky, we get her back and we bury Ashworth so deep he never sees daylight again. If we're not careful or not lucky—" He stopped himself. Let's just be careful. 2 nights later, everything fell apart at once. Ethan had just left the intersection, walking his usual route home, when a black sedan pulled up beside him far too slowly to be a coincidence. He didn't wait to see who got out. He ran, the way Frank taught him, straight for the lit windows of a corner grocery, ducking inside as car doors opened behind him. He called Frank from the store's payphone, hands shaking so hard he nearly dropped the receiver. They found me. They knew exactly which street I'd be on. Frank's blood went cold. He'd been careful, meticulous, about never discussing their locations anywhere that could be overheard. There was only one explanation for how they'd known Ethan's route home. Someone had talked. Frank met him 2 blocks away at a diner, both of them watching the door. Together, they went back through every conversation, every meeting, every scrap of information shared and with whom. It didn't take long to land on the only answer that made sense. "Claire," Ethan said, the realization landing like a hit. "She's the only one who knew I was staying late tonight." Frank's jaw went tight. "I warned you." They found her outside the Beacon's office the next morning before she'd had her coffee. Her face went pale the second she saw them, and in that one unguarded second, before she could arrange her expression, both of them saw the truth. "You sold us out," Ethan said, and his voice came out smaller than he wanted, more hurt than angry. "It's not what you think," Claire started. "Then what is it?" Frank cut in, "because it looks exactly like what it is." Claire's silence answered better than anything she could have said. "I didn't think they'd actually hurt anyone," she finally said, tears coming despite herself. "I thought I could manage both." "There's no managing this," Frank said. "Not anymore." He walked away without another word, Ethan beside him, leaving Claire alone on the sidewalk with a guilt that belonged entirely to her. What none of them knew yet was that Claire's usefulness had already run out. Ashworth had what he needed: Ethan's routines, Frank's involvement, confirmation of how close they'd gotten to Sophie's name. That afternoon, an anonymous tip reached Claire's editor alleging fabricated sources and undisclosed conflicts of interest. By evening, she was suspended pending investigation, her career unraveling with the same cold efficiency that had unraveled everyone else who'd gotten too close to Julian Ashworth. She'd believed she was using him. She'd only ever been a tool, and now she'd stopped being useful. Meanwhile, with their location compromised and no one left to trust, Ethan and Frank had nowhere that felt safe. Ethan didn't sleep that night either. He kept replaying Claire's face on the sidewalk, the half-second before she composed herself, and he hated that some small part of him still wanted to believe her. That she'd made a mistake, not a choice. That people who smiled at you and asked about your mom and remembered how you took your coffee couldn't also be the reason men in a black sedan knew your walking route home. Frank found him outside the shop around 2 a.m, sitting on the curb with his jacket zipped to his chin. "You should be inside," Frank said, sitting down next to him without being asked. "Couldn't sleep." "Yeah." Frank looked up at the sky, what little of it you could see between the buildings, no stars, just the orange smear of city light reflecting off low clouds. 12 years ago, I trusted somebody I shouldn't have, too. different circumstances. Same feeling. Does it get easier, trusting people again? Frank thought about that a long time before he answered. Not easier, just more careful. You start checking who benefits before you believe what they're telling you. It's not a great way to live. It's just the way that keeps you alive. Across the city, Julian Ashworth stood at his 40th floor window, watching the sun go down behind the skyline he'd spent 2 decades quietly conquering, and made a decision he'd put off for exactly one reason. Loose ends were manageable right up until they weren't. "Bring them both in tonight," he told Miles Dawson, a former security contractor whose loyalty had been bought years ago and never wavered. "The boy and the old man, no mistakes. And the girl, Pierce's daughter? She's already served her purpose against the judge. Move her tonight. None of this touches a property with my name on it." What Ashworth didn't say was that Sophie Pierce's kidnapping had never been random. She'd stumbled onto evidence linking his foundation to a second, much larger operation stretching into at least 3 other states. Falsified documents, laundered funds, corruption reaching further into the justice system than even Frank had imagined 12 years ago, which meant Frank's old case had never really been about a handful of dirty cops. It had always been about Ashworth. Frank simply hadn't lived long enough inside it to see the shape before the department shut him down. That night, holed up in the back room of a shuttered auto shop Frank still had a key to, he finally told Ethan the rest of the story he'd carried alone for over a decade. "My partner," Frank said, staring at nothing. "Detective Sarah Kowalski. She pulled the first thread on Ashworth's foundation, discrepancies in a shell company's filings. Days after she took it to our captain, she was dead. Called a car accident. Except her brakes had just been serviced, and the shop had no record of anything wrong with them. You think he killed her? I know he did. I could never prove it. And the harder I tried, the faster my career came apart. By the time they pushed me out, I'd lost everything Sarah helped me build, and Ashworth walked away richer and more celebrated than ever." Ethan sat with that, feeling the full weight of how far back this went. How many lives had already been quietly ended before he ever picked up a squeegee? "So what do we do? Cops won't help. Claire sold us out. We don't have proof that holds up." Frank turned something over in his mind. We need something undeniable, something that puts Ashworth at the scene, connected to Sophie, that no lawyer can make disappear. Without that, we've got a story nobody in power wants to hear. Neither of them, in that tired, frightened moment, thought about the cheap action camera Ethan had won at a neighborhood raffle months earlier. The one he clipped to his jacket collar most afternoons out of habit, recording snippets of traffic and street performers he never bothered watching back. When a memory card filled up, he swapped in a new one and tossed the old one in a shoebox at the back of his closet, always meaning to go through the footage someday. Somewhere in that box, under a pile of birthday cards and a broken watch, sat the card from one particular grey Thursday. Ethan pulled his knees up to his chest, back against a cold workbench that still smelled faintly of motor oil and rust. "Your partner, Sarah, did she have a family?" Frank was quiet long enough that Ethan thought he wouldn't answer. "A husband. No kids yet. They were talking about it." He rubbed a hand over his jaw, rough with 2 days of stubble. I went to her funeral in a suit I had to borrow because I'd sold mine to make a mortgage payment, stood in the back. Her husband wouldn't look at me. I think some part of him always believed it was my fault for dragging her into the case in the first place. Was it? No, Frank said, too fast, and then quieter, more honest. Maybe. I don't know anymore. I've turned that question over so many times it doesn't mean anything to me now. It's just a shape I carry. Outside the shuttered shop, headlights swept the boarded windows and kept moving, not for long. Miles Dawson's men were 3 blocks away and closing. They'd stayed too long in that auto shop. The first sound was small, a boot scraping gravel in the alley, and Frank's head snapped up before Ethan even registered it. "Kill the light," Frank whispered, already moving toward the back door. Too late. It came off its hinges with a crack that echoed through the empty garage bay, and a flashlight beam swept the room a half-second before Dawson's men came through both entrances at once, cutting off the alley and the street in the same breath. "On the ground! Both of you! Now!" Ethan's whole body locked with terror, every instinct screaming to run, but Frank's hand clamped his shoulder. "Stay still. Don't give them a reason." "Easy," Frank said, steady, despite the fear Ethan could feel through his grip. "We're not armed. Nobody needs to get hurt tonight." One of the men laughed, low, like that was a funny thing to say. They were bound with zip ties that bit into Ethan's wrists, blindfolded with a strip of cloth that smelled like motor oil, and walked, not dragged, walked, hands firm on their shoulders, the way professionals move people who might scream, into the back of a windowless van. Ethan heard the doors slam and felt the van pull away, tires bumping over something, a pothole maybe, and he counted turns in his head the way he'd seen someone do in a movie once, left, right, straight for a long time, until he lost count somewhere around 11 and gave up. Nobody spoke the whole ride. When the van finally stopped and the blindfolds came off, the light was different. Dimmer, industrial, buzzing faintly from somewhere overhead. They were standing in an abandoned warehouse near the rail yards, the kind of building the city had forgotten existed, concrete floor stained dark in patches Ethan decided not to think too hard about. And standing near a folding table at the center of it, hands in his pockets, dressed like he'd just left a donor dinner, was Julian Ashworth. He didn't raise his voice. He never had to. "Ethan Reyes," he said, like he was confirming an appointment. "Kid who washes windshields." He looked him over once, unhurried. "You've caused me a headache." "Let us go." Ethan's voice came out steadier than he felt. "People know we're missing." Ashworth almost smiled. "Your mother can't leave her chair, let alone go looking for you. Your reporter's already been handled, and the detective," he glanced at Frank without much interest, "already got buried once. Nobody's coming, Ethan. Nobody ever does." "Sarah Kowalski," Frank said. Just the name. He'd waited 12 years to say it to this man's face, and he wasn't going to waste it on a speech. Something crossed Ashworth's expression. Not guilt, just a flicker of irritation, a man swatting at a fly he thought he'd already killed. "That was a long time ago, Detective. Where's Sophie Pierce?" It wasn't a question anymore. Ashworth nodded once at Dawson, who stepped forward holding the folder Claire had handed over days earlier. He didn't make a speech out of it either. He just dropped it into a rusted metal drum, flicked a lighter, and let it catch. Ethan, watched weeks of work curl into ash, and felt something give out behind his ribs. Ashworth was already checking his watch. "Clean this up," he told Dawson, and walked out without looking back, the warehouse door banging shut behind him, leaving Ethan and Frank alone with Dawson and two armed men. No evidence, no allies, no one coming. That was what everyone in that warehouse believed, because Ashworth had made one assumption he never bothered to check: that the folder burning in the drum was everything they had. He had no idea a memory card the size of a fingernail was sitting forgotten in a shoebox above a laundromat in Pilsen, holding footage from one grey Thursday nobody had thought to check. Dawson crouched down in front of Ethan once Ashworth's footsteps faded, close enough that Ethan could smell coffee on his breath. "Kid, you should have just wiped windshields." He said it almost like an apology. Ethan didn't answer. Frank, still working the zip tie against a rough edge of the workbench behind his back, kept his eyes on Dawson and said nothing at all. The old habit of a man who'd once interrogated killers for a living, watching, waiting, doing the math on how many seconds it would take two armed men to become a problem he could solve, if it came to that. Rosa Reyes had never let herself fully imagine losing her son. When midnight came and went with his phone going straight to voicemail, that wall of denial finally cracked. She called the only person she could think of. "He's not here," Tony Russo told her, already grabbing his jacket. "Stay put, I'm coming." Tony arrived within the hour, and together they sat at the small kitchen table, running through every place Ethan might have gone. It was Tony who remembered something Preacher had said weeks earlier, almost in passing, sliding a folded card across the counter. "If anything ever happens to me or the kid, call this number. Don't wait. Don't ask questions." Tony had tucked it away and forgotten it, the way people forget the warnings of men the world has already written off. Now, with Rosa's terrified eyes on him, he dug through his wallet with shaking hands until he found it. The number belonged to Special Agent Renata Vasquez, FBI, Public Corruption, and, though neither Tony nor Rosa knew it, the former partner and closest friend of the very detective Frank Merrick had lost 12 years earlier. While Tony made the call, Rosa searched Ethan's side of the room and found at the back of his closet, under a pile of old birthday cards, the battered shoebox he thought he'd hidden well enough. A dozen small memory cards inside, each labeled in his careful handwriting. She didn't understand what she was looking at. Agent Vasquez, arriving less than 30 minutes later with an urgency that told Rosa exactly how seriously Frank's warning had been taken, understood immediately. "Which one's from the day he came to you about the SUV?" she asked Tony, who scrambled to remember the exact date. They matched it against the pencil-scrawled labels, and within minutes, Vasquez had the card loaded, her hands steady despite the tension in the small apartment. The footage was shaky, badly framed, the kind of accidental recording nobody expects to matter. Ordinary traffic, Ethan's sneakers, a blur of passing cars, but near the middle of the clip, the camera caught something none of them had dared hope for: a reflection. In the tinted glass of a storefront across the intersection, angled just right, it had caught the mirrored image of the Escalade's rear hatch swinging open. The bound wrists, the terrified eyes, and beside her, clear enough to identify without doubt the face of the man who'd stepped out to close it. Julian Ashworth. The license plate, reflected in that same sliver of glass, was legible enough to run. Vasquez sat back slowly, staring at the frozen frame, and for the first time in 12 years, let herself feel something Frank Merrick had given up hoping for. "We've got him," she whispered. Everything moved faster than Rosa could have imagined. Agent Vasquez had spent years quietly building her own case against Ashworth's foundation, hampered by the same problem Frank had run into 12 years earlier. Plenty of suspicion, never enough proof that could survive a defense attorney. The footage changed that. Combined with financial records she'd already gathered, the pattern of disappearances Frank had tracked from his corner, and a judge whose own terrified calls to federal contacts had quietly alerted the Bureau weeks earlier, the pieces locked into place. Within hours, a coordinated operation was underway. At the warehouse, Frank and Ethan had spent the night bound to a support beam, guarded by two men who talked less and less as the hours dragged. Dawson kept checking his phone, jaw tightening every time the screen stayed dark. Frank noticed. 20 years of reading rooms didn't just switch off because a man was tied to a beam. "Something's wrong," he murmured to Ethan, barely moving his lips. "Ashworth doesn't go quiet, not for hours, not for anybody." He was right. At that exact moment, 3 miles away, elevator doors were opening on the 40th floor of Ashworth Tower, and 6 federal agents were stepping out with a warrant Agent Vasquez had spent the night convincing a judge to sign on an emergency basis, waking him up at 2 in the morning with a photograph pulled from a memory card and a look on her face that left no room for argument. Ashworth was reaching for his coat when they found him, already halfway through composing the sentence he assumed would end the conversation. "I'm going to need to see some identification, and then I'm going to need to call my attorney." And it didn't matter, because the agent nearest him simply said, "Julian Ashworth, you're under arrest," and kept talking through the rest of it while another agent took his arm. He didn't resist. He'd never had to before. Back at the warehouse, the first sound Ethan heard was a bullhorn, tinny and far off, then closer, then a door somewhere behind him, giving way all at once with a crash that made Dawson spin toward the sound with his hand already moving for his weapon. "FBI! On the ground, now!" Boots on concrete, more than Ethan could count. Flashlight beams crossing and crossing again through the dark like something alive. Dawson froze for one long second, long enough for Ethan to think, absurdly, that this was the moment everything would go wrong instead of right. And then he lowered his hand slowly and got down on his knees without being told twice. His 2 men dropped their weapons so fast, one of them clattered and skidded across the floor toward Ethan's feet. Someone was cutting the zip ties before Ethan even fully understood it was over. Frank was up the second his hands were free, moving toward Ethan, pulling him up by both shoulders. "You okay, kid? Look at me. You okay?" Ethan couldn't make words come out yet, so he just nodded, shaking too hard to stop, and let the old detective pull him into a hug that felt, for the first time in what had started to feel like forever, actually safe. Somewhere behind them, agents were reading Dawson his rights while he stared at the floor and said nothing at all. Sophie Pierce was recovered soon after from a second property. One Dawson gave up almost immediately once he understood how little leverage he had left. The first thing she did, reunited with her mother, was ask through tears whether anyone had found the boy who tried to help her. Daniel Briggs was arrested at his own desk, the burner phone still in his jacket pocket. Claire Whitfield, stripped of her job and her credibility, cooperated fully with investigators, giving up every detail of her dealings with the Foundation for whatever small mercy the truth might still buy her. And Julian Ashworth, celebrated philanthropist, a man who'd spent 2 decades believing himself untouchable, sat in a federal holding cell, staring at nothing, while prosecutors built a case on years of buried evidence and one forgotten memory card from a 13-year-old's raffle prize camera. The story that broke that evening bore no resemblance to the one the local news had run about him for years, but by then, none of it mattered nearly as much to Ethan as walking back into his own apartment above the laundromat and finding his mother waiting at the door, alive and sobbing with relief. She grabbed him so hard it almost hurt, one hand fisted in the back of his jacket like she was afraid letting go would make him disappear all over again, and she kept saying his name over and over, half in English and half in Spanish, the way she did when words in just one language weren't enough to hold what she was feeling. Tony stood in the doorway, wiping his eyes with the heel of his hand and pretending he wasn't, and for a long moment nobody said anything else at all, because nothing else needed saying. In the weeks that followed, the city that had spent years celebrating Julian Ashworth picked through the wreckage of everything he'd hidden behind that polished smile. Federal prosecutors built their case methodically, and this time, no amount of money made a single piece of evidence quietly disappear. Frank Merrick's name resurfaced too, though not the way the department had buried it 12 years earlier. Agent Vasquez stood beside him at a press conference and told the city the story it had never been allowed to hear. A detective who refused to stop chasing the truth even after it cost him everything. His pension was quietly restored, and his badge, retired with honor this time instead of scandal, was returned to him at a small ceremony attended by exactly the people who mattered: Ethan, Rosa, Agent Vasquez, and, after a long overdue phone call, his daughter, who flew in from Ohio for their first real conversation in over a decade. Judge Eleanor Pierce, understanding what a homeless veteran and a 13-year-old boy had risked to bring her daughter home, made sure Rosa never had to choose between rent and dialysis again. Ethan still visited the old intersection sometimes, though he didn't need to work it anymore. Tony still ran his cart. Grace still waved from her Civic. And where Preacher's milk crate used to sit, there was, for a little while, just an empty space, until Frank came back one afternoon, not as a forgotten man the world had stopped seeing, but as a retired detective who'd finally gotten his justice. "Told you," Frank said, settling onto that same crate with a tired smile. "You were gonna do something big one day." Ethan laughed, the sound lighter than it had been in longer than he could remember. "You knew?" "I had a feeling," Frank said. "Some people the world just never bothers to notice until it's too late. Good thing you noticed first. There's a lesson somewhere in all of it, if you're willing to look." The officer who laughed the reporter who traded her conscience for a headline, the businessman who thought his money made him invisible to consequence. Every one of them underestimated the same thing, the people the world had already stopped looking at. A homeless man everyone assumed was broken, a 13-year-old nobody thought was worth a second glance at a red light. Sometimes courage doesn't come from who you'd expect. Sometimes it comes from the ones we've trained ourselves to walk past every day, still watching, still noticing, still waiting for a chance to matter. Ethan Reyes got his chance at an ordinary red light on an ordinary Thursday afternoon, and when it came, he didn't look away. What would you have done if you were in Ethan's place? Tell us in the comments, and if you enjoy powerful stories like this, don't forget to subscribe, leave a like, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss the next one.